Hey friends, it's Corey from Hey Let's Make Stuff. Lately I've gotten quite a few requests for more Adobe Illustrator content. If you want to design your own SVGs for your Cricut Silhouette or Laser, then Adobe Illustrator is a really great program to get to know. I've mapped out a series of Adobe Illustrator tutorials for here on YouTube. We are going to be starting with the basic workspace today and then working our way through some tutorials that will teach you how to use Adobe Illustrator to make your own SVG files. In today's video, we're going to talk a little bit about why Adobe Illustrator is so good for creating SVG files, and then we're going to walk through the workspace. We're basically going to open it up, create a new file, and look at all the parts of Illustrator. We'll also talk about a few of the tools that you're going to need to know, but there is so much more that we need to learn, so this is just a very basic overview, and then in future tutorials we will go into more depth on certain features and tools that we can use to create SVGs. I wanted to give you a caveat before we got started. I am almost primarily self-taught in Illustrator. I learned a very small amount in graduate school, which was 20 years ago, and I didn't really use it for 10 years. And then 10 years ago, I started using it more, and everything I've learned basically since then has been self-taught, which is great news for you because that means that you also do not need like a fancy graphic design education to be able to use Illustrator. It also means that the way I do things may not be the same as other tutorials. There are so many ways to do all the processes in Illustrator, and I'm going to show you how I do them. But if you're watching another tutorial from another creator, they may do something differently, and you may prefer their way, and that's totally fine. Because there are so many ways to do things in Illustrator, it really is a process of figuring out what works best for you. Additionally, I'm using a Mac, but things should look very similar on a PC. I am a huge fan of keyboard shortcuts. I'm going to drill this into you through this entire series that you will be so much faster at creating SVG files if you can get to know those keyboard shortcuts. I also have a freebie for you. You can download my free printable Adobe Illustrator keyboard shortcuts cheat sheet. It's a mouthful. You can download that for free. I've specifically only included the shortcuts that I think are most helpful for creating SVGs. So there are obviously tons and tons of shortcuts, but some of those just will not apply to designing SVG files. So I've only given you the ones that I think are most important for our particular process. And I want you to know that Adobe Illustrator can be really intimidating, but if you give yourself the space and time to learn, it is a really robust program that will allow you to create really beautiful SVG designs that can be cut natively on a Cricut. You can also use this program to create printables and presentations, mock-ups, and more, so if you want to do things beyond just SVGs, you will learn tips and tricks that will help you with that as well. Are you ready? Let's head into the software. Before we dive in with the parts of our workspace, let's talk about how Adobe Illustrator is a vector design software. This means that Illustrator works in points, which we're going to call anchor points, and in lines, called paths. This is instead of pixels like Photoshop might work with photos, JPEGs, PNGs, those sorts of files. You may hear those also referred to as raster images or bitmap images. The wonderful thing about vectors is that they can be resized to any size you need them to be. You can make them very small or very large, and they never lose any resolution or quality. So over here on the left, I have a vector popsicle, and then over here on the right, I have a pixel popsicle. Now, obviously you can see here on the right that this is already pixelated, but if I go over here to the left and I zoom in over here, you can see that no matter how far I zoom in, it doesn't get pixelated at all. It's similar to how a lot of fonts work. You can enlarge a font and put it on a billboard, and it will look exactly the same as if you print it out on your home printer. And that's because fonts are vector-based, or at least most fonts are vector-based. And why is this vector-based system important? Because if you think about how a cutting machine works, it cuts in lines and it turns at points, which is exactly how a vector file is built. If you try to upload a bitmap pixel image to Cricut Design Space, for example, it will try and turn it into a print then cut image. You know, it'll cut around the edge, but it won't have any of the details. But if you upload a vector image like an SVG, your Cricut will be able to cut your image just fine. All right, so let's dive into Illustrator. When you open Adobe Illustrator, you'll be greeted by this welcome screen. And then up here at the top, there will be just some, common presets for sizes of different documents. Below that, if you have anything recently opened, it will be there. You can see I have my little popsicles there that I had just had open. But for our purposes, we're going to hit New File. Here we have the New Document tab. Across the top up here are some presets. If you have made recent files, they will show up here. I have all these different file sizes I've worked with in the past. But over here on the right is where we can actually make our document. So you can give it a name up here. I'm just going to call this one Test. And I like to work in inches. I generally use 12 by 12 as my sizing guide because that's the size of a Cricut mat, so it seems to make sense to me. You can also change the number of artboards. So this is basically the number of files you have within your larger file. For this example, we're just going to use one, but if you wanted to use more, you could make multi-page documents, you can make printables, you could make a bundle of SVG files at one time. I do use multiple artboards a lot, but for this, we are just going to use one. Then let's go down here to color mode. I generally design my SVG files in the CMYK color mode, which is for printers, versus the RGB color mode, which is for screens. This is because the actual color of the cut files doesn't really matter. You can have a purple file and cut it in yellow paper or whatever. But along with my SVG files, I also give folks PNG and JPEG files, which are both, bitmap pixel style images. And those are much more likely to be printed, and I want those to be true to color as possible. If you are just doing SVG design that's going to be on screen, then you can change the color mode to RGB because your colors will often be a little bit more vibrant that way. All right, let's click Create. Now you'll see your workspace, and I know that this can be very intimidating. There's a whole bunch of tools here. It's not really clear what any of the tools do. I'm actually pretty useless in Photoshop. Every time I go in there, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I feel the same about Photoshop as you might feel about Illustrator. Now, your workspace might look a little bit different than mine, but let's try and get a little bit more on the same page. So if you go to the upper right here, to this top tool in the top right corner here, this is where you can choose the type of workspace that you have. So let's select Essentials Classic. Now your workspace should look a little bit more like my workspace. We are going to actually add some tools to our workspace. So once you have a workspace that you're really happy with, you can also go back up to that same menu up there and save it as a new workspace. So you can see here that I have Corey's workspace. That's has a lot more tools than you see here. Once you start, working in Illustrator, you'll know what's helpful for you. Then you can create your own workspace. And if you ever want to save over that workspace with even more tools out, you can do that as well. Let's take a look at all of the parts of the workspace. If you have a PC, your computer might look a little bit different than mine, just with this top menu bar, but it should function similarly. So basically, we have all of these drop downs up here. This is a really powerful area because a lot of the tools, especially over here on the right, a lot of those tools also live up here in the menu drop down, especially under Window. So I don't feel like Window is a particularly helpful drop-down name. It reminds me of, Windows 10 on a PC. It's not one that I would automatically go to, but there are a lot of important things here. So if you, for some reason, can't find what you're looking for, you may want to try looking under this Window drop-down. We will go through a lot of these tools in upcoming tutorials to get you more familiar with them. Right below that is the Control panel. Now, this is a contextual panel, which means that depending on what I have selected on my artboard, it will change. So let's say I have a rectangle here, a square. Now you can see that I have some tools specifically for this square. I've got color, I've got some alignment tools, I've got sizing, I've got some transform tools. But if I then select some text, you'll see that I have those same color tools, but then I have like character and some paragraph and then some alignment. This menu changes depending on what you have selected. This is also where I tend to deal with my colors. So let's think about color for just a moment. In Illustrator, there are two color boxes, your fill and your stroke. So your fill is the color that fills your shape. Then there is the stroke. This is what is on the outside. So right now you can see a very thin black line. Let's go ahead and make it yellow and then also increase the width of that stroke so you can see it a little bit better. So our fill is this sort of magenta color and our stroke is this yellow color. If you pull this into Cricut Design Space or another program, however, it's not going to read this yellow stroke. There are some other things we need to do to it to get it to actually show up like this in Cricut Design Space, and we'll be going into that in future tutorials. Right below the control panel, we have our document tabs. Document tabs function similarly to internet tabs. It's all of the documents that you have open. I only have this one open right now, but if I had more, they would all be here. You could click through all of them by just clicking on the tab. You can copy and paste between tabs, which is really helpful. And then below that is our artboard. This is where the magic happens. All of your designs will happen on the artboard. The white part is the document size we created. So mine is a 12-inch by 12-inch square. Think of it as like a piece of paper or a canvas. You will want all of your final artwork to remain on the artboard, but you can use the gray space for dragging things out of the way. However, when you're saving your file, you want just your SVG on the artboard. You don't want anything off of it because that will also upload. So when you go to save your file, make sure that you don't have anything off the artboard. We will be spending a lot of time on the artboard creating our artwork. So let's look at some of the tools we will use to do that. Over here on the left is the toolbar. If you hover over a tool, it will play a little video that will tell you what it's about. So this is the select tool. and it allows you to select entire objects and move them around. So if I create that rectangle again with the select tool, which is keyboard shortcut V, I never hit this button over here. I always just hit V. You want to make sure you're using those keyboard shortcuts. You can move your image around. You can use the corner handles or the side handles to resize it. If you hold the shift key, it will resize proportionally. Use the side handles, make it wider, make it thinner. You can also, if you hover over any of the corners, you can rotate it. And then if you hold the shift key, it rotates in specified amounts. And that's basically the selection tool. The selection tool is your home base. I am constantly clicking V to get back to this tool as my just main tool that I'm using when I'm working in Illustrator. Next up is the direct select tool, which is next to it, but I'm going to have us use A as our shortcut. So click A and you'll see that my cursor changed. And this allows you to just take part of an image and move it around. So I'm just going to click this one point here, and then I can move just that point around by itself, which is very cool, right? You can also just move the side. You can just move the path. You can move it up and down and around like that. You can also select, by holding down the shift key, select more than one of these little points. And then you can move those while the other one stays. Look at that, I just made a kite shape. This direct select tool will allow you to modify shapes in a lot of ways that are very cool beyond just being able to make rectangles and circles. The next tool that I'm going to point out, but I don't expect you to understand it yet, is the pen tool. The keyboard shortcut for the pen tool is P. So you can draw shapes with the pen tool. So let's say I kind of wanted to draw that kite shape. I could do that with the pen tool just like that. Very easy. But the pen tool is very robust. So if you click and then hold down, you'll see that it creates an arc. Just like this. There is so many ways you can use this pen tool to create all sorts of shapes. And it is a little bit difficult to get a handle on, but once you do, it will open up your design possibilities so much. I have a full tutorial about using the pen tool coming up, but it is so helpful in so many ways, but it is one of those tools that does take a little bit of practice. There's also the text tool, which obviously creates text. And you'll remember that I said I always hit V to get back to that select tool. The problem within a text box is if you hit V, you get the letter V. So instead I hit escape, and that also gets me back to that text tool. Text is one of the easiest ways to create SVGs, but there is a lot that needs to happen before you can actually just export this as an SVG. If I wanted to export this now, it wouldn't appear in Cricut Design Space because it is still a font. We need to outline it. We need to do some other things. I'm going to go into an entire tutorial about how to use fonts in SVG design. It will be very in-depth, but for now, know that you can play around with text, but you're not going to be able to export it as an SVG quite yet. Next up, we have the line segment tool, which is this tool over here, but I like using the backslash key, and that basically gives you a line segment. Like I said when we were talking about the square, if I export this as an SVG now, this line segment won't show up as a nearly 10-point weight stroke here. It will just show up as a one line in Cricut Design Space. There are other things we need to do to it to make sure that it actually exports as a line that is this wide. But for now, that's where that tool is. We also have two tools that I have these sort of silly mnemonics to remember. The first is how to create a rectangle. So you can click the rectangle tool, but you'll also see that it is an M for a shortcut. So in my head, every time I go to make a rectangle, I say mectangle. So here's my little mectangle. And then underneath the rectangle tool, if you hold it down, you'll see that you have some other shapes as well. So there's the ellipse tool, which makes sense with the L, but I learned to call it the Lurkle tool. So it's L for Lurkle instead of circle. So M for rectangle, L for ellipse or circle. You can create both of those shapes. And then finally, at the bottom of the toolbar are more color options. So right now you can see that my stroke, which is the outlined one here, is yellow, and inside I have actually no color. So if I put it over here, you'll see that I do not have it filled with white. It is just no color inside. But I could add a color. Let's see, let's add like a bright green. And then I could, if I wanted to, swap them using this little arrow. And that just swaps the fill and the stroke. You can double click into these and then you'll get some color picker options. Again, I will have a whole tutorial over using colors, so you can play around with it, but don't worry that this is the only introduction to color that you're going to get. And then over here on the right, we have our panels. Panels are where more advanced processes live. So instead of just drawing a simple rectangle, you can use tools here to manipulate that rectangle by combining it with other shapes. The panels can get a little bit confusing, so do be patient with yourself. If you hover over a panel, it will tell you what it is. So this one is the properties panel, and then if you click on it, it will open up all of the information for that panel. So let's talk about a few panels that you're going to want to include. The first here is properties. Properties is actually one of my favorite panels. So instead of keeping it here, I'm going to actually pull it out, and I'm going to drag it to the other side here. And I'm going to have this properties panel open all the time. If you have a smaller screen, I have a very large screen. If you have a smaller screen, you may not be able to keep this open all the time, and you can just click on it to open it like I did at first. But there's so much here that I really like having this open. The properties panel is contextual, just like this bar across the top. It has a lot of the same things. So let's say I wanted to make that circle again. It will give me circle actions. So it gives me the size, how big it is over here, another place to change the color and the opacity. I can also do quick things like create an offset. That's a really quick way to create an offset. But if I have text, it will show me all my text options here, including the character and these paragraphed options, bullets, numbering, alignment. Some more panels up here that you might be interested in. Again, more places to change your colors. You've got swatches, we've got color panels, those sorts of things. Another panel that doesn't exist here is the Pathfinder Align and Transform panel. So remember how I said earlier that we need to go to Window to find a lot of things? Let's go to Window, go to Pathfinder. This gives us three sort of related tools: Pathfinder, Align, and Transform. And we can actually shove these in here wherever we want. You can put them wherever you'd like in your little panel toolbar here. But let's check out what they each do. So let's create those rectangles again. Make them two different colors here. Make one of them pink. So now if you've ever worked with Cricut Design Space and you know the combine tools, I know there are similar tools in Silhouette Studio. This is basically what the Pathfinder does. So we're going to open the Pathfinder. And for instance, we can unite these two shapes into one single shape, just like that. We can minus front, which is basically sort of like subtracting, just like that. So we just have this leftover piece. There are a bunch of little tools here that do a lot of similar things that they do in Cricut Design Space. Right above that is Align. These are very similar again to Cricut Design Space, with one big difference, which I really like. So let's say we only have a single shape here. If you only have a single shape selected, it's going to automatically align to the artboard, which means that if I want it centered on the artboard, I can horizontally align it, vertically align it, and it's on the center of my artboard. If I have three shapes that are sort of different here, and we'll do this one. If you have more than one shape, it will default to aligning it to the selection. So if we want to align these all in a row, just like this, you can see this one here is stacked on the others. We could align them, we could distribute them evenly like this. You can also click on Artboard and be like, no, I actually want them all left aligned to the artboard. But generally it will stay on the selection, which is probably what you're used to. Right above Align is Transform. The properties up top are very similar to what you'll find in the properties panel over here, but for some of the shapes, they have other properties, which are super fun. So for example, with the rectangle, it'll give you rounded corners. So we can increase here and get rounded corners. If I draw a circle here, you'll see that I can make pie graphs. Cool, right? You can even grab these little handles, stretch them around, make a little Pac-Man. Very cool. There's even a button here to swap it, so that you just have your little wedge. So this part down here, again, is contextual. It changes with whatever you have selected out here. Working our way down, another very important panel that I'm not going to go into very much today, I just want you to know that it is here, is the Layers panel. So you automatically have a layer created, and then if I draw a circle, it will be on that layer. You can see it under the drop down. There is an ellipse there. If I draw a second one, it will be there. We'll have two ellipses. The most important thing we are going to use the Layers panel for is to make sure our SVG files are correct when we go to export them. There's a lot we can discover that is incorrect by looking at the Layers panel. And so if the Layers panel looks good, you should be good to go uploading your SVG to any design software. One more fun tool that you may want to add is glyphs. So again, we'll go up to Window, go to Type, and go to Glyphs. And again, it will open a whole window for us, but we can just tuck it right in there. Now, if we click on it, you'll see that I have this font selected. This is just the main font we've got going here. Let's just type something just like this. And this is all of the glyphs for that font. So every glyph is basically every single letter form, number, punctuation symbol that a font may have. Some fonts have alternates. So if I choose a font that has some alternates, you'll see that when I select the letter, it gives me some alternates here. So I can have an O. And let's say I wanted to make this a lowercase h. I've got some other options here. I could have, you know, a little bit O or an H here that has a little bit of a tail. This is just a fun way to make your fonts more interesting. We will be going into this more when we go through our fonts lesson, but it's kind of one of those things that I think a lot of people are excited about in Illustrator, so I wanted to show you where it was. Again, you cannot export this as is. There are some other things we need to do to it before you can export it as an SVG, but you can play around with these font tools. If you make a file that you like, go ahead and save it. And then in a future tutorial, we will talk about how to actually make that into an SVG. The final part of our work area is the status bar at the bottom, and I will tell you that I never look at it, so you could probably ignore it as well. The one important thing here is that you can zoom in and out. However, I would suggest you learn the keyboard shortcut for that. On a PC, it's Control plus or minus, and on a Mac, it's Command plus or minus, so I can easily, just on the keyboard, zoom in and zoom out by just the keyboard. You may also want to be able to move around your artboard. If you have a Mac with a magic mouse, you can just move your finger across the mouse and it will move your artboard. I love this. It's one of my favorite little features. If you don't, you can hold down the space bar and that gives you this little hand grabber and that'll allow you to move around. So you'll click and grab and move it around. And this is really helpful like when you're zoomed in and you're like, oh, I need to get over here to this edge, you know, that sort of thing. Whew, that was a lot and we really just covered the workspace and a few tools. In the next tutorial, we will be talking about Illustrator shapes, specifically how shapes are made in Illustrator using paths, anchor points, and handles. Now I know these are probably terms you've never really heard before, but they are sort of the building blocks of anything you create in Illustrator. It took me a long time to learn these things, and I wish I'd learned them sooner, which is why I'm including them sort of at the beginning of this tutorial series. Once you understand how these basic building blocks work in Illustrator, it really will open up a whole bunch of other design capabilities to you. If you found this Illustrator tutorial helpful, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like. If you have questions, please ask those down in the comments. If you want more Illustrator tutorials along with laser, Cricut, and sublimation tutorials, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you next week.